I'm really honored that we can have four scholars and activists and thinkers and doers join us today and talk about their work with Rohingya. And I thought about this panel because I actually know, other than Yasmin, who I recently met, I know the other three panelists and have known them for quite a long time. And over the years, they have all found their way to working with Rohingya. And I wanted to hear from their different perspectives and disciplines, the work that they've been doing and what are their current thoughts about the Rohingya situation. So without further ado, we are going to speak today about citizenship, erasure, belonging, and storytelling from a health and human rights perspective among the Rohingya. I have four panelists here. I have given them all, asked them all to pick one or two of these four themes and speak to them from the perspective of their discipline and their work. And so we will go in turns, and then at the end we'll have time for Q&A, which you can put your questions in the Q&A link at the bottom of the screen. So my name is Elka. I'm an assistant professor at the Dartmouth Institute, and I have been working in some aspect of global health and human rights for the last 20 years. And before I introduce our first speaker, I just wanted, for those of you who may not be familiar with what's been going on with Rohingya, although you may have heard quite a bit in the news recently, I just wanted to give you a quick update. So in August of 2017, about 700,000 Rohingya fled Myanmar for Bangladesh and joined about another 300,000 people who were already there in refugee camps. And currently the Rohingya refugee camps are considered the largest consolidation of refugees in the world. They are a minority Muslim group. They have been living in Myanmar for many years, for some of them for hundreds of years, even though the country is majority Buddhist. And so there's been a lot of social and racial exclusion from the nationalist Buddhist leaders over the past several decades, and quite a lot of violence and oppression has been targeted at this community that has really been viewed as an invader or an outsider. So before the military coup, which happened just recently in February, the military had ruled Myanmar from about 1962 to 2011. And during this time, the Rohingya were treated as second-class citizens and were actually stripped of all citizenships and rights in 1982. So this included things like restrictions on movements, needing permission to marry, only being able to have 2 kids, not having access to equal services, education, and so on. And what happened in 2017 was that there was an attack on some police posts in northern Rakhine states from some Rohingya insurgents who ended up killing about 12 Burmese security personnel. And in response to that, there was sort of this widespread response from the Burmese government and troops and local Buddhist mobs who essentially took to burning Rohingya villages, attacking and killing a lot of civilians. And satellite imagery and reports have suggested that the attacks were coordinated and that this was a widespread campaign to try to wipe out the Rohingya in Myanmar rather than just a response to the attack that had taken place on the police posts. And so this is the event that led to many Rohingya fleeing and 700,000 of them ending up in Bangladesh. So with that, I think our panelists will shed some light on what's been happening recently and sort of where they have been working with the issues of the Rohingya. So Yasmin will be our first speaker, and I'll introduce each speaker before they go. And she is a Rohingya social justice activist. She was born in northern Rakhine state of Myanmar, and she fled to Thailand in 1995 with her patients. And then, with her parents. I read a lot of health literature. And she remained a refugee in Thailand until about 2011. She formerly served as the president of the Rohingya Human Rights Network, which is a nonprofit group led by activists across Canada to advocate and raise public awareness of the Rohingya genocide. She has continued to engage with Rohingya issues through an intersectional lens, both in Canada and internationally. She has worked on various projects such as Time to Act, Rohingya Voices exhibition with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, the Genocide Learning Tool with the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and the anthology I Am a Rohingya, where she published her poetry along with other Rohingya poets from around the world. So with that, I will yield the floor to Yasmin Allah.
Thank you very much. I am going to start by reading a poem by my wonderful friend and colleague, Mayyu Ali, who is currently in Cox's Bazar. And his poem is titled, That's Me, a Rohingya. And it was written in 2017. When I was born, I'm not a baby like you. Without a birth certificate, I'm like just a dead. When I'm 1 year old, I'm not a child like you. Without a nationality, I'm like just a pet. When I'm in school, I'm not a student like you. Without a Burmese face, I'm like just a future baron. When I'm in another village, I'm not a resident like you. Having approval for overnight, I'm like just a loony bin detainee. When I pass over my town, I'm not an inhabitant like you, holding Form 4 authorization. I'm like just a nomad. When I'm in university, I'm not a fresher like you, being denied a professional major. I'm like just an invalid. When I try to approach with my peoples, I'm not accepted like you, being suffered from apartheid and chauvinism. I'm like just a quarantined. When I wish to get married, I'm not a fiance like you, having approval for marriage. I'm like just an alien. When I intend to repair my earthen hut, I'm not allowed to do like you, facing tangible denials. I'm like just an invader. When I arrange a small trade, I'm not a vendor like you, being ongoing, restricted, and confiscated. I'm like just a pauper. When I apply for civil service, I'm not a candidate like you, receiving a motivated rejection. I'm like just a segregatee. When I'm hospitalized in a state-run clinic, I'm not a favored patient like you, being marginalized and discriminated. I'm like just an oustee. When I bestow to fellow belief in, I'm not a faith like you, being restricted for worship and demolished mosque. I'm like just a non-mankind. While I'm of an orchestrated riot, I'm not a survivor like you. Without an insurance of safety, I'm like just a ripe victim. When a new year turns in, I'm not a civilian like you, being under the colorful decades-long operations. I'm like just an inventory item. Even I live in my country where I was born. I can't name it my own like you. Without an identity, I'm like just an immigrant. Even I breathe air of this sky. I'm not a human being like you. Without a reliable undertaker, I'm like just a loner. Even I see the sunrise. I'm not a living kind like you. Without a fertile hope for tomorrow, my life is like just a sandy castle. Despite apex of humanities and dire of immoralities, I'm quite surrounded in, my skin remains trembling. Just to feel once the essence of full freedom, my heart remains hoping, just to walk once like a man in my world. Indeed, no one nowadays is like me, the only one as alike as that's surely myself. Perhaps I'm none other, just a Rohingya. I'm sorry, this is really emotional for me. Yeah, I didn't expect that much emotion to spring out of me, but I think that Mayyu did a really, really good job in capturing the essence of who we are, which sort of led me to the next part of what I want to share in this. I wanted to share like some pictures in the slides, but it's not possible right now because of all of this being on my phone. So with the theme of what I want people to know about Rohingya, my people, to really put it simply, I want the world to look at us as not just merely victims or burdens of the international community, or something that people have to, flinch when they think about. All I want is that we are viewed as an equal human being, and we are acknowledged for the rich history and the beautiful culture that was unfortunately robbed away from us by the structure that is hell-bent on dispossessing from people across Myanmar to accumulate wealth and power, no matter who it hurts in between. And that is the military institution, or the Tatmadaw. The erasure of Rohingya runs much, much deeper than the surface level of us being disenfranchised within our own country or being made stateless within our own homeland. It runs deep into the level of individual feeling of detachment from our own people, from the communal responsibility, from the communal feeling. And it had fragmented the core of our community in a way that we harbor a lot of mistrust among each other. And that is, by extension, the result of various different human rights violations that took place, including and especially the sexual and gender-based violence that was a hallmark of the current violent campaign, or the campaign that happened in 2017. But leading up to those mass rapes, Rohingya women have been pushed closer and closer to home, where before this time, before any disenfranchisement, before we even regained our independence from the British colonialist, women were participating in the society fully and visible. To this day, I still mourn the fact that the aspects of matriarchy that existed back then no longer exist now, because women are kept closer and closer to home in pursuit of safety, but it also further enforces the idea that patriarchy weighs down upon us all. I want people to learn that Rohingya are not just refugees, because by extension, when people mention the word refugee, we are no longer on an equal ground as humans. There is a huge negative connotation when it comes to the word refugees. We become a sort of burden that needs help, needs people to protect us, need people to care for us. But we are resilient people. We are a people in exile. Yes, we may need help from the global community, but it was because the global community ignored our plight from the get-go. This all is preventable, and we survived thus far with the neglect that had took place and had brought us to this point. At the brink of destruction, we are still resilient and strong. We are strong enough that we have done everything to resist the attempt to obliterate and erase us completely. And we carried ourselves across the river with the wounds, with the scars of the trauma that have been caused, that have been internalized, that have entrenched that have been entrenched within the system for years, not just within 2017, 2012, or in the 1990s, but for 70 years. So this all hasn't really, this all hasn't really translated into us completely disappearing. It shows that our people are willing to do anything to survive, are willing to fight for our rights and freedom. And right now, the responsibility is no longer on us to actually realize our own will and our own agency, but it is on the international community and people around the world to actually help us and amplify our voices. Now, in terms of my work, I have been working in advocating and raising awareness about the Rohingya plight for the past 3 years, since 2017. Since I started working, I didn't really know how to go about doing advocacy or being an activist at all. But I do know that my people didn't deserve any of the things that they have been harmed or hurt in this manner. It was incredibly difficult at first to conceptualize how the misery of my people would ever end. But as I started working with more people and working closely with people on the ground inside the refugee camps, as well as with my family and people in Rakhine State, I had gotten many opportunities to speak with people that I would not otherwise dream of. And visiting the camps, I realized that a lot of what Rohingya are trying to do or say have been silenced by various different layers of oppression, even within the country that is currently hosting them. Not just Bangladesh, not just Malaysia, but all across the board, unless, Rohingyas are, unless the Rohingya are the ones that are in, European or Western countries, those are different story. But most of the people who are still stuck within the Southeast Asia or South Asian region continuously have their voices muzzled. So there is a need to change and shift our narratives. And I'm currently trying to continue to work in shifting that frame of Rohingya, not being a burden, but actually human resources, full of potential, and that our agency is not a threat to anyone's democracy or anyone's sovereignty, but a way forward for Rohingya to actually be able to benefit the host countries and further, ensure that there is a security and there is peace within that local community. There is a lot of disempowerment within my own community because of re-victimization of women, human trafficking, sex trafficking, and various other issues that are internal, but also are results of external factors. So in order to move forward at all, I realized that Rohingya people would not have their solutions anywhere else except for within Myanmar. And so since then, I started working with different groups within Myanmar, especially from ethnic communities, young people who are leading different advocacy initiatives within Myanmar and outside as diaspora. And we work on coming together, drawing on common thread, drawing on the idea that the concept that we have the common enemy, which is the Tatmadaw. And we realized that without a uniform, without uniformly coming together, without actually understanding each other's pain and each other's oppression, we would not be able to then realize our will against the military as an institution, because it is so deeply problematic, and it has enforces different ideologies that we all need to reject and get rid of, eradicate. So fortunately, I've been able to work with an organization called ALCIAN, and they've been working alongside a lot of human rights defender within Myanmar and outside to actually train them and help empower them, do a lot of capacity building trainings. And the project is called Bridges Myanmar, which basically what it does is bridging the gap between the various different ethnic groups to actually bring people together so that there is a platform, a foundation for us to build this into something further in the future, hoping that we could rebuild Myanmar into an actual democratic society. So in order for Rohingya to actually find peace at all, the future would lie within Myanmar. And this current coup, since February 1st, has proven to be something that as terrible as it is that civilians are being harmed and killed on the daily, it is an opportunity for Rohingya to actually empathize and extend our solidarity with the people all over Myanmar. And it shows the kind of heinous crimes that the military is capable of doing, regardless of who it hurts. If it needs to protect its own interest, it would do that, regardless of whether or not the international community is looking. So while we're working on the solidarity building, reconnecting, having a dialogue, I also am trying to work on emphasizing that the rejection of the military institution has to come from an ideological point of view as well. And that is the divide and conquer, the land dispossession, the exploitation of minoritized groups, and the various other forms of oppression that the Burmese public majority may have not been able to be as critical of in terms of its positionality in being adjacent to power, and how its position has enforced the idea that there is different layers of superiority and the different social strata where ethnic communities are ranking lower than the Myanmar public, the Bama, or that Rohingya are even lower in that strata. So all of this all comes down to being more critical and applying that critical lens and intersectional lens to the kind of country that we are left with after all of this exploitation and human rights violation. So while having dialogue with people in Myanmar, the decolonization of our beliefs and ideologies that we've been socialized by the military in maintaining the military status quo and the current power structure for the past 70 years needs to happen, and it needs to happen on a broader scale. And so currently I'm trying my best to have this dialogue and build this sort of solidarity, even though it's only I'm only capable of doing that via the internet right now, but I'm hoping that as this coup fail, we would be able to continue this conversation, and hopefully we would get as far as having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for not just the Rohingya, but also reparations for all of the ethnic communities that have been hurt systemically by the Tatmadaw. Thank you.
Yasmin, thank you so much. I'm sorry that you weren't able to share your pictures with us, but I think you've done an amazing job of letting us know what we need to learn, from Rohingya themselves. I'll move on now to Dr. Jennifer Leigh, who is a friend of mine, a former colleague from many years ago, and she has worked in global health and the humanitarian sector for nearly 2 decades now. Conducting interventions, research, evaluations, and working in outbreak response. Her work emphasizes local participation, capacity building, and accountability to affected populations. And her recent work includes an assessment of violence against the Rohingya and a study on child marriage in humanitarian settings, an analysis of global capacity to manage outbreaks, and an evaluation of the US response to the Ebola outbreak. She has an MPH from Johns Hopkins and a doctorate in public health from Harvard. So with that, I will yield the floor to Dr. Leigh.
Thank you so much. I feel like I could listen to Yasmin all night, but we'll go ahead here. Let's see. Okay. So as Yasmin was saying, for a long time, the government of Myanmar has worked to erase the lived experiences of the Rohingya. And this has occurred in a lot of ways, but a lot of it has been preventing their story from getting out to the outside world by limiting access by the media and aid organizations and denying the accusations that were put forth of persecution and abuse and creating their own false narrative. So part of the goal of the work that I'm going to talk about tonight is to document evidence to countervene that erasure by systematically recording the violence in locations across northern Rakhine State and capturing from Rohingya individuals themselves, their stories about that violence. So in 2018, I worked with Physicians for Human Rights and Johns Hopkins University to document the events in northern Rakhine State that occurred in August of 2017 to provide robust evidence that could be used to help bring justice through appropriate accountability mechanisms. And the idea was to support the existing evidence, which at that time was a lot of survivor testimony and anecdotal information and photos and videos. We're hoping that through the use of systematic methods, we could help paint a more comprehensive picture and add some rigor. So the study aimed to document the events and provide that evidence that could be used to help achieve accountability. So the study that we conducted had three arms. It included forensic evaluation, which is examining the sequelae of violence, like physical wounds on the body, and comparing it with a survivor testimony to assess the consistency of that story, which is a very rigorous form of evidence, as well as quantitative and qualitative data collection. So we set out to collect information as comprehensively as possible. So we conducted a cross-sectional census with leaders from as many Rohingya hamlets as we could contact. There are about 900 hamlets in Rakhine State, and about 600 of those have Rohingya occupants, and we were able to contact leaders from 590 hamlets and 8 urban wards. So we were able to reach the vast majority. And then a subset of those respondents that met certain threshold criteria for events that had occurred in their village were then interviewed to document a narrative account of their experience and the experience of their village, what happened to them there and during their flight to Bangladesh. So the data itself was actually collected by Rohingya surveyors. We found individuals within the camps in Bangladesh who already had survey experience, and then we were able to provide additional training so that they were the ones collecting this information from their community. And we wanted to make sure that an already traumatized population was comfortable with the people who are documenting their stories. And by increasing their training and experience, we hoped to increase the research capacity in the community generally. So the stories we heard were harrowing, but there was a remarkable consistency to what we heard. Over and over again, we heard these stories of the military and the border guard police attacking from the east, driving villagers west, houses, mosques, and fields being burned, and villagers being detained and killed and violated. These are a couple of quotes from the qualitative interviews that we did, and I think they're quite poignant. So I'll just read the first one here. There's a hamlet very close to our hamlet in the west. In that hamlet, there's a camp where the military always stays. The military entered that hamlet at 2:10 p.m. on 27 August. They came east towards our hamlet and started to shoot guns. The BGP police and Rakhine people also participated with them. They started to burn houses while firing at the people and at the houses. We ran out of the hamlet. Some ran away and some ran to the east, crossing the river. From our hamlet, 8 people died. Around 400 people in the village tract died by gunshot. And a village tract is the local administrative unit for a collection of villages. So as I mentioned, we wanted to do some systematic quantitative data collection as well. So we documented the kinds of destruction and violence that occurred. And as you can see, it was extremely widespread. And over 80% of respondents reported that homes and fields and farms in their villages were burned or destroyed. And almost 90% of participants said that there was violence in their hamlet directly. So we also asked respondents when these attacks occurred, and you can see here the clustering in such a narrow time period focused around the 25th of August, attacks all across the 3 different townships in northern Rakhine State and many different villages all happened almost simultaneously. And that is pretty clear demonstration of the level of coordination and even the pre-planning that went into this offensive. So violence occurred both in the hamlets and continued while villagers were fleeing to Bangladesh. There are some really outstanding numbers here. 91% of respondents reported being beaten or injured with weapons. 71% of people said they were starved. 10% of people said they were gang raped. And for 3 of these categories, the violence during flight actually exceeded that in the village. So shootings, landmine injuries, and mortar and grenade fire. And this shows that the Rohingya were being attacked even as they fled to Bangladesh. We asked respondents to name the primary reason for their flight. There were counter narratives going around that, people were fleeing for economic reasons or because they wanted to get free aid in Bangladesh. And our respondents very clearly articulated they left because there was violence or fighting in their hamlet or very nearby. So these were people fleeing out of fear and being driven out by violence. This is some of the documentation that occurred through the forensic arm of the study. So these are the kinds of photos and documentation that we do. For instance, if an individual says that they stepped on a landmine while crossing the border into Bangladesh, and they show us, the injuries to their lower limbs, we can say, yes, that is extremely consistent with landmine violence. Or if someone says they were shot in the back while swimming across the river, and we can show, scars from gunshot wounds on their back, we can say that that's highly consistent. It's a way of strongly corroborating the stories that victims are telling. Satellite photos were another source of evidence. Although there was heavy cloud cover around the dates of the attacks themselves, even after, the evidence remained, and it really was clear that there was widespread destruction. So this photo shows a clear example of a pattern that we saw again and again and again. The bottom half of the photo shows the Rakhine village, and you can see the structures are standing, the green trees are flourishing, and the top half shows the Rohingya part of the village, and it has been completely burned, completely leveled. We saw this over and over and over again. So it was a very targeted violence. And now the government has bulldozed many of these burned areas, erasing evidence of the attacks, and in some cases building new structures atop them, making it impossible for the Rohingya to return home. So it's clear that the perpetrators leading the attacks were government personnel, and there were also significant involvement of civilian extremists and civil governments such as village tract administrators. 90.4% of respondents reported border guard police being directly involved as perpetrators. 87% reported the involvement of the military or their Tatmadaw, and 2/3 of individuals reported the involvement of Rakhine civilians. The complicity of the military is also clear in the use of military assets in these attacks. It's quite striking when you hear accounts of helicopters and tanks being used in attacks against unarmed villagers. For one, that's horrendous. And 2, the only entity with those resources in the area is the Tatmadaw. So it's very clear evidence of their involvement. So from our data, we estimated that approximately 7,800 people died as a result of the August 2017 attacks. And this is consistent with the previous mortality estimate that was published by MSF, and similar trends were found by the fact-finding mission in the US State Department in their reports. And this number of, around 7,000 or 8,000 is more than 20 times higher than Myanmar government's official figure of 400 deaths during this time. And the actual number may actually be closer to 10,000. So our findings are pretty powerful, and they're congruent with findings from other sources, which strengthens the overall body of evidence. What we found is evidence of both genocide and crimes against humanity. It followed a prolonged period of increasing restrictions of rights, as well as, threats and warnings of the violence to come. It was widespread. Nearly 8,000 people died. 700,000 were displaced to Bangladesh, and this affected villages across all 3 townships in northern Rakhine states. And it was very systematic. It was led by the government. The chain of command was involved, from foot soldiers to generals. It wasn't just some rogue soldiers, and the attacks were coordinated over a very short time frame. So we've done all this documentation, but aside from just the importance of recording what happened, we also want to make sure that this evidence can be used for accountability. So these are some of the existing international accountability mechanisms. Pertinent in this context is the UN Human Rights Council had actually established before this, in March of 2017, an international fact-finding mission on Myanmar in response to previous violence. And they continued their work to document the events in August 2017 and following as well. But their mandate ended in September 2019. So after they published their report, they handed over the work to an independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, which we call the IIM. And that was mandated to collect evidence of the most serious crimes and violations of international law and prepare files for criminal prosecution. And there are 2 mechanisms by which criminal prosecution could occur. There's the International Criminal Court, which was established in 1998 by the Rome Statute and entered into force in 2002. And that lays out 4 crimes that the court can prosecute: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. And 2 of those are applicable in this case. The ICC prosecutes individuals, not states. So this would be about trying military leaders, the leadership that coordinated the attacks. But although 123 states are party to the statute, Myanmar is not one of them. So it was a question of whether the ICC could follow this event with a prosecution. But jurisdiction was established because the event spilled over into Bangladesh, who is the signatory. So in November of 2019, the prosecutor was given approval to proceed with an investigation, which is still underway. And whereas the ICC tries individuals, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, tries states, and that's the UN's principal court. And I'm going to defer discussion of that because we have an expert speaking more on that later on. So that's an overview of our documentation work from 2017. Subsequently, we've done another report documenting cases of sexual violence. I did a study last year on child marriage in the Rohingya camps. And our work is ongoing. I spoke to the IIM just this morning about sharing more of our Rohingya data. And now we're working on documenting the unfolding violence following the coup. So I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Jen. Jen and I used to work for a health and human rights organization that actually ran a clinic in the Bronx where asylum seekers could essentially have a physician document evidence of torture going by the wounds on their body, which was the first time that I learned about evidence collecting, of torture, but also how important that is as evidence in a court of law. So I know we will hear more about that later, but thank you so much for sharing your data. When the 4 of us met and talked, we wanted to present a picture of the Rohingya, which is as close to, multifaceted and complete and human and all these complex identities and so on that we could get. So we're really fortunate to have Fariba S with us, who is a Bangladeshi-American visual artist and creative director. She has a BA in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies from Columbia University and a MA from NYU. She's also former Fulbright Fellow in photography to Bangladesh, working with the Grameen Trust. And I have known Fariba for about as long as I've known Jen, for about 15 years. And I have been to many of the shows where she has shown her photographs and some of her other multimedia work at the Queen's Museum, at the Asia Society, Exit Art, the Museum of African Art. The list is very long. She has also worked as a digital innovation, human-centered design lead for Apple, for Estee Lauder, and has volunteered with organizations in the community organizations like Sakhi and Groundswell, and the Acid Survivors Foundation and the South Asian Women's Creative Collective. Most recently, she has been working with Rohingya refugees on storytelling through art workshops and collaborative art in the Kutupalong mega camps in southern Bangladesh. And she lives in Brooklyn, New York, and Joshua Tree. So Fariba.
Thanks so much, Elka, for inviting me. And Jen and Yasmin, it was incredible to hear you both share your work. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully this should connect.
Yep. If you go to slideshow, we should be all good.
How's that?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, great. So give me 1 second. I'm just going to move something out of my way. View. Okay. Having a little glitch. Okay, here we go. So I want to focus my section on storytelling and how that relates to belonging in the context of marginalized and persecuted communities, art making, co-creation, and documentation from a different angle. Yasmin, I can resonate. I resonated a lot when you talked about, wanting the Rohingya to be acknowledged for their humanity and not always viewed as victims. And I'll talk a little bit about my practice, but being from Bangladesh, I've gone back and forth to Bangladesh my whole life. And a lot of the impetus of my work was to portray the people in a light that was different from kind of the famine or poverty or like bloated bellies that Bangladesh was associated with for so many years. So I really appreciated what you had to say about humanizing the Rohingya. So a little bit about my practice. As Alka said, I'm a visual artist. I'm based in New York. And my practice is centered around photography as a medium for documentation, storytelling, and charting the imagination. So I work in a lot of different mediums, as you may have been able to tell from Alka's bio of me, but I really am centered in documentary work, and a lot of my training is in documentary photography. So over the years, I've done work with the Bangladeshi community in the Lower East Side in Manhattan to do stories after 9/11. I've also worked with Grameen Bank, as Alka mentioned, acid survivors, and more recently I've been going to the camps in Bangladesh, and that was a little bit delayed due to the pandemic, but I'll show you some work from there. In general, I'm interested in stories that go a little further beyond the crisis layer, and I focus on details of daily living that connect us to us all as human. I think the purpose, when Alka asked us to talk, think about the purpose of our work, I would say that mine, in regards to what I'm doing with the Rohingya camps, is to circulate stories that facilitate belonging. The first way I want to do that is by creating stories that really have more depth. I think there were a lot of stories that came out around 2017 that were very critical to raising awareness during the mass exodus, and some of them were very nuanced and went deep. I think some of that has subsided just with the breaking news cycle and the pandemic. And at the moment, there's a really rich window to kind of show these people and stories, as Yasmin talked about, like kind of beyond the victimization and the poverty and the trauma. And the reason why this is so important to me as it relates to belonging is that these stories that come out or are suppressed or partial really have deep consequences on so many facets for the way, how people continue to be received in the world, and how they will move in the world later, sort of psychically, whether they belong or don't, or are separate or other forever. So I think there's a sort of fine balance in artwork between helping raise awareness, but then also kind of going beneath some other layers. Another purpose of my work is to co-create stories. So a project that's been delayed is I'm working with the World Food Program and the United Nations to co-create murals and storytelling with Rohingya refugees. And I'm interested there in elevating the refugee voices and empowering authorship in their own storytelling. Again, not just to tell about the trauma, but just details of their lives, which I'll get into a little bit in a photo essay that I'll share. So, in summary, I think keeping the Rohingya refugee story alive visually and a narrative that is dynamic is instrumental to ensuring this community receive the dignity they deserve. And certainly I'm not the only one doing this. There are a lot of really great projects happening. There was a piece by Ai Weiwei that was released about 1.5 years ago, and it was using virtual reality to show life in the camps. Sesame Street is in the camps creating new puppets. So there are very creative things going on. And I'm looking forward to joining those in my next round of work. So I think I'll just move right into, conscious of the time, just a photo essay that I did 1.5 years ago in the camps. I was, it's called The Role of Gold in the Kutupalong mega camps. I did it for a small outlet in New York. I first visited the camps in 2018 to study the material and fabric culture of the Rohingya. I was contemplating a kind of weaving project and just doing some research. And through my research, I spoke with families about their stories of survival and loss and joy. And I witnessed also a lot of social nuance. And I heard about love marriages and teenage crushes and all these things that just make these people people. And as an offshoot of that first visit, I'm actually working on a project that's not out yet, but it's on love stories from the Rohingya refugee camps. I even met one man who was running his own radio show, and there's a lot of life going on there, and I think sometimes that gets lost. So while I was there, I also noticed something a little unusual, a proliferation of gold stores. And I thought that was quite curious in the middle of a refugee camp or in these sort of side streets. So what I learned is that while many intergovernmental programs, provide the refugees with their food and basic home items like floor mats and cooking supplies, Rohingya actually rely on gold for their financial security, and they use it to barter and take out loans to kind of conduct their side activities and to, purchase things they want, like snacks and fashion items that their ration cards can't get them. For women in particular, gold is multifaceted. Women are often the most in danger, but they are often the ones carrying the gold. It's either ancestral or, and that's something we see in a lot of cultures. But it because gold holds undeniable value inside and outside of the camp, it also yields women a certain power. So this picture, I just wanted to zoom out. It's just a picture of the mega camps, and in the background you can see Myanmar. 80% of the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh are women and children because so many men were killed by the military. And that's, leads to a lot of gender violence and issues, but there is this, again, particular role of women and their gold. I also just wanted to share the general area of where the camps are. This is Cox's Bazar. It's a 75-mile long beach. It's the longest natural sea beach in the world in southern Bangladesh. And it's a location for decades, it's been a location for tourism, but also a very thriving fishing port. Migrations to Bangladesh. So a lot of people mentioned the river. There's a river between Myanmar and Bangladesh that many people cross. These migrations are often treacherous and sometimes deadly. Many of these excursions take place under moonlight at night. And in order to get across, the Rohingya often use gold in exchange for safe passage. I met two sisters, their names were Mosina and Sitara. They told me about piling into a boat with 13 of their family members in the middle of the night to cross the river. But first the boatmen had to be paid. So each of them forfeited bits of their gold wedding jewelry that was under the fabric on their bodies. When one of the sisters arrived in the camp, she pawned a portion of her jewelry to get a loan for her husband. And what's left, she keeps in a metal suitcase, kind of locked away in their home. Her husband said, since we have no property, the women and girls in our community buy gold as security, or we pawn gold for cash outside the card ration system. So again, the security provided by gold is important for women. It sort of gives them a power and social standing, but they are also at the same time the most vulnerable to exploitation and day-to-day trickery and gender-based violence. So, sorry, I'm having a little issue. Sithara, she's a widow who sold her a lot of her gold to feed her family, which is a bit of a sad common story. These gold jewelry stores are kind of tucked away. They've really proliferated, but they're tucked away in between like snack stores and toy stores and clothes stores. Gold's role in the local economy has been, it's sort of a facilitator of some kind of livelihood, but at the same time, it's the location of a lot of risk. A lot of men take their wives' jewelry and sell it to buy methamphetamines and other drugs. But many save up for gold as not just as financial security, but to wear as celebration, as markers of wealth and belonging and beauty. This is Sumaya. She was given a lot of gold by her husband, and he when asked about it, he said, "I just want her to look beautiful, and I also want her to make sure she's okay if anything happens to her." Elder widows are the most frequent customers at gold stores. Unfortunately, they're also usually underpaid for pawning or selling their gold. And for others, gold is a fashion statement. And there is some fashion in the camps, and it's alive. I'm going to just flip through the rest. This is a gold store that was closed down. The Bangladeshi government started to crack down on these stores because they were imposing some security risks. This is Kareem. He's someone he's a Rohingya who worked at a Bengali gold shop, and he quit because he saw that so many refugees were being given inflated prices. So he left the business he was in. And I'll end with this one photo. This is one of the sisters that I talked to in the beginning, and she said, I only have this bit of gold left. And then she sort of shut her suitcase and climbed up a step ladder and put the suitcase away. And she said, if we have to flee again, this is what we have, and I have to keep it safe. I think I will wrap there, and I'm running out of time a little bit, but hopefully that gave you a little glimpse of just some of the fabric of life in the camps.
Thanks, Fariba. Fariba's photography is stunning. So if you get a chance to look her up, please do. There's so much more there. So finally, last but not least, and before I move on to our last speaker, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A. We'll probably have about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So not a lot of time, but certainly enough to, if you want to, if you have a burning question to be answered. So Tafatspa Pasipanogia is a partner at Foley Hogue LLP, which is an international litigation and arbitration, which is a law firm, and she's works in the international litigation and arbitration department, and she's also the chair of its Africa practice. She represents sovereign states in international disputes concerning natural resources, mining, human rights, the environment, the law of the sea, and territorial boundaries. She's a member of the team that helped the Gambia secure a provisional measures order from the ICJ, which Jen spoke about, instructing Myanmar to stop its genocide of the Rohingya. She also recently helped Mauritius defeat an ICSID claim brought by UK investors concerning the Lamorne UNESCO World Heritage Site commemorating resistance against slavery, and help Uruguay defeat a $4 billion iron mining claim. Prior to working at Foley Hogue, she worked with me many, many years ago, but Tafatspa has worked with several international NGOs on issues concerning genocide in Rwanda, natural resources, conflict in Angola, and HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis, among many others. So I am happy to welcome my friend Tafi as the final panelist.
Thank you so much, Alka, and thank you to the team at the Dickey Center for the invitation to be here tonight. It's hard to speak as a lawyer after such fascinating remarks from this, 3-4 wonderful women with diverse perspectives. So I'll try not to drone on too long about the law. As Alka mentioned, I have the privilege of being on the team of lawyers who represent the Gambia in its case against Myanmar before the ICJ. And I should note that the views that I share are just my personal ones and not those of our client, the Gambia, or my firm. Our work seeks to stop the genocide against the Rohingya and seeks justice on their behalf. As Alka mentioned, in January 2020, the ICJ actually ordered Myanmar to stop further acts of genocide against the Rohingya. So we're now in the merits phase in which the parties are submitting pleadings concerning the claims, and the court will ultimately have to decide whether Myanmar has indeed committed genocide against the Rohingya in violation of the Genocide Convention, which is very tough to do. And if so, what reparations Myanmar must make to the Rohingya. And our work, as reflected in the oral and written pleadings, relies on the brave work of the Rohingya themselves, like Yasmin, and individuals working through NGOs like Jen and Alka, and people visualizing the experiences of the Rohingya like Fariba. I wanted to focus on the topic of erasure. And the issue of erasure is, of course, central to a genocide case. As many of you know, genocide is an internationally recognized crime where acts are committed with the specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And the attempted erasure of the Rohingya has taken many forms. Erasure of women from community, as Yasmin so poignantly explained to us, clearance operations of the nature Jen described, mass rapes, executions, burning entire villages, deprivation of food and livelihood, restricting marriages, obligatory birth control, refusing to register births. The list of ways in which the Rohingya have faced erasure goes on and on. Another that was evident at the provisional measures hearing that we had at the ICJ is the refusal to even say the name Rohingya. For 3 whole days at the hearing, the Myanmar delegation refused to refer to the Rohingya as Rohingya. In a case about the genocide of the Rohingya people, they managed to find a way never to refer to the people as Rohingya. Yet there is historical evidence that the Rohingya existed as the Rohingya in Rakhine State since as far back as the 17th century. And I wanted to specifically focus on erasure that has taken place through citizenship laws, administrative erasure, if you will. Now, stripping people of citizenship has long been seen as a foundational step in genocide. Once you strip people of their citizenship rights, it's easier to otherize them, dehumanize them, and to begin to destroy them in the various ways that we've talked about and we've seen. In Myanmar, the campaign to strip the Rohingya of their citizenship began really with the 1982 citizenship law, which has been implemented through various clearance operations and citizenship verification processes, all of which are geared to diminishing the number of Rohingya in Rakhine State and ultimately erasing their identity as an ethnic group. The right of the Rohingya to citizenship in Myanmar and then Burma was recognized at the time of independence and for several decades after that. The constitution recognized their citizenship. There were paths for Rohingya to become citizens, and they enjoyed citizenship status for decades until October 1982, when Myanmar adopted this new citizenship law that stripped them literally of that right. The new law redefined citizenship in Myanmar so that it extended only to the so-called pure-blooded national races, whose ancestors were considered to have settled within Myanmar before the British conquest in 1824. And although the Rohingya resided in Myanmar since at least 17th century, their ancestry prior to 1824 was ignored by the state, and they were excluded from citizenship. As the then head of state, General Leigh explained, the Rohingya were deliberately targeted for loss of citizenship because in the state's view, they were a race of people who could not be fully trusted. And from that moment on, citizenship in Myanmar would be based on race alone, and certain races, not including the Rohingya, would qualify. In General Nguyen's words, racially, only pure-blooded nationals will be called citizens. As the special rapporteur of the situation of human rights in Myanmar observed, the 1982 law excludes the Rohingya minority from citizenship, leaving them de facto stateless. And as a result of the way that the law was implemented, the Rohingya became the largest group of stateless persons in the world. An estimated 1 million people lost their citizenship as a result of that law. And upon being stripped of their citizenship, the Rohingya were automatically deprived of the fundamental rights that could be exercised in Myanmar by Myanmar citizens. And we heard a lot of how that manifests itself in Mayyu Ali's poem that Yasmin so beautifully read. But after that, they didn't have the same access to food, health, livelihood, humanitarian aid, and even freedom of movement. There's one part of the poem where he says, when I pass through my town, I'm not a citizen like you are, holding Form 4 authorization just like a nomad. And it just, how it must feel to have to seek authorization to leave your village or your little piece of land just to go to the hospital, to go and work, to go fishing. It's a phenomenal level of oppression and repression. And despite the widespread criticism of the citizenship law, Myanmar maintained it and has continued to keep it in its books. And sometimes they've even enforced it through clearance operations like the one that Jen has mentioned, but there was one that preceded it that was known as the Clean and Beautiful Nation. And the government said the purpose of the campaign was to verify citizenship of the inhabitants of Burma, but in fact it sought to create a clean and beautiful nation through the violent removal of citizens. And some of the same kinds of atrocities that we heard in the 2017 ones occurred then. And when the UN criticized Myanmar for it, the Myanmar permanent mission to the UN responded by saying that, and I quote, "The so-called Rohingyas never belonged to the national races or the national groups of Myanmar. The Rohingyas do not exist in Myanmar, either historically, politically, or legally." And so that's what they believed, and that's what this fiction is, what they have been trying to enforce through all these measures. And beyond that campaign, Myanmar has implemented the 1982 citizenship law through other verification processes. And the latest one that's happened most recently, Myanmar requires all non-citizens to hold a national verification card. And if you don't hold this card, you don't have access to fishing licenses, you can't get food, you can't travel out of your village to get these forms that allow you to travel. But the cards explicitly state that the people holding them are non-citizens and brands them as foreigners. And Myanmar authorities processing the applications have required that Rohingya register as Bengali, and they're in fact prohibited from registering as Rohingya. And I just want to end with the experience of a Rohingya man from Mang Dao Township which his story exemplifies really Myanmar's effort to force the Rohingya to renounce their identity in order to obtain this card that's essential for all of these other things that they need. So in his words, he says, "I was not," this is what happens as he tries to get this NVC, this card. "I was not allowed to provide answers to the questions on the NVC application form, except for the names of my family members. The officer wrote in all the other answers in the form, even though I was present. For example, he wrote in my form that I came from Bangladesh by waterway, even though I was born in Mang Dao Hospital, and I gave him my birth certificate to prove it. When I left the immigration office, I asked myself, who am I starting today? I felt guilty, as if I had made a mistake. I had helped destroy myself and my ethnic group." And so it's wonderful to hear of Yasmin talk about the resilience and focus on that, because he hadn't destroyed himself. He had tried to survive and managed to survive. And it's just so important that we kind of all try to do our part to help with the strong Rohingya and all of the efforts that they're making. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tafi. And I want to second that, coming back to the way we started with you, Yasmin, that, we want to be here to acknowledge the reality, but at the same time to celebrate the resilience of the Rohingya people and those who are in Bangladesh and those who also live among us. And the work that you're doing to bring awareness is really incredible. And I hope that all of us will go out after this call and, look for Rohingya organizations in our communities that we can work with. I have asked people to drop questions, so I see that some have come up and I'm going to read them. So the first question is from David de Keisel. Do Rohingya as a people want to return to Myanmar? If not, is there a framework or precedent for people robbed of their citizenship to gain new citizenship in a new nation? I suppose that second part is for Tafi. As a group, though, not through individual asylum. So maybe Yasmin, you want to take the first part. What is your perspective on whether Rohingya even want to return to Myanmar?
This was fortunately, because I had been able to travel to the camps just before the pandemic hit, and we all had to halt all of our travels. Every single civil society groups that I sat down with, spoke with, all of them mentioned in one voice, separately of course, that they're not in Bangladesh to live long term. They're not there to be provided aid. They're not there to resettle. They're not there to find peace. They all want to go home. And all that they could think of is home and closure that they've never gotten from having to flee and being forced to basically being coerced to be expelled. And they realize that their future does not lie in Bangladesh at all. Neither does it, extend to the resettlement to the third country in any way, because when our identity has been savored from our own homeland through ways of, the delegitimization, like Tafi had mentioned about the, the ways that they pass legislation or impose different legislation to limit our access to different necessities, as well as our access to citizenship rights. That moment has basically cut the ties that we've had for the past centuries. And it is important for not just the Rohingya in my generation or older generation, but younger children today to not associate themselves with the identity of a people in exile, of a people who are refugees, but truly a people who actually belong to Myanmar. And so many people in the camps, especially civil society groups, are always looking forward to actually have dialogues with people within Myanmar, as I mentioned earlier, that I am very, very hopeful with this turning point in the history of Myanmar, that we may very well have a chance to actually build something that was not there.
Thank you. And I'm hearing from the person who asked the question that they think that kind of obviates the second part of the question. I have a question for Fariba from Sharman, who's a student of mine, and I think from Bangladesh. What was your experience working with the locals who were part of the process of accommodating the Rohingyas in Bangladesh? We are known to be a very hospitable nation historically. Are we doing a good job of supporting them?
That's a great question. And yes, we are known to be a hospitable people. So I think Jen might have some input on this as well, just from being in the camps. But I would say you kind of hit the head on the hammer of something that I'm going to be exploring soon, which is how the host community and the refugee community are working together. As you can imagine, like it is a massive influx of people, 700,000 people, to the tiny country of Bangladesh at the southern tip. And that is just pure recipe for like resource disaster. So I would say that my experience there was, I was incredibly relieved to see the amount of cooperation that I did see, but a lot of that is due in part to the resources that are being made available to the Rohingya refugees are also being made available to the Bangladeshis. Otherwise, I mean, you just cannot have those people coexist. So I'm answering rather qualitatively at this point because I haven't been there in some time. But in general, there is a lot of cooperation, and the World Food Program, which I'm going to be working with very closely soon, does, pay a lot of attention to how they're integrating the host community in some of their programming. And then again, how they're distributing resources. So I would say, I mean, from my experience, that there was a lot of balance. But that being said, I'm sure on the ground, there's all kinds of tension that we know and don't know about. I think the Bangladeshi government right now is, from what I'm hearing, is taking a really big turn, unfortunately, in how they're perceiving this whole situation. So in the last couple of years, it's been perceived more as like a humanitarian crisis, Bangladesh stepping up. but Bangladesh is currently in the process of building a fence around the entire mega camp. So, take what you will from that messaging. But yeah, that's the best I can answer right now. And I'm looking forward to going back and just really understanding it a little further with like the changes that are happening literally as we're talking on behalf of the Bangladeshi government and how that influences the people.
I'll just add a comment if I may. I think, in some of the southern camps in Teknaf, when the refugees came, they were integrated into the community. Bangladeshis brought them into their homes. People set up tents in people's backyards. They got jobs in local people's fishing boats. So I think people were very hospitable. But as Fariba said, it's so many people, and it's putting a lot of strain on the resources of a very rural, and not heavily populated area. And I think that tension has definitely grown over time, and suddenly there's more competition for food at the markets, and rent prices are going up, and it's harder to get jobs on fishing boats, and that's causing definitely a lot of tension. So it's a difficult thing. I think the government did a lot for the camps. The army built most of the roads and most of the latrines and wells in the camps, but at the same time, the government is very firm that this not become a permanent settlement. There's prohibitions on the construction of permanent buildings in the camps. You mentioned the fence that's going up, and now some refugees are being moved to a silt island in the Bay of Bengal, Bashan Char, which is of questionable habitability. It's a lot to handle this huge influx of refugees, and it takes a lot to maintain and support them. And I think Bangladesh has done a lot, but it is starting to turn, and it's difficult to be both mindful of the tension that they're under and the continued need to assist this population.
There's just one more note, and I think this it's not always well known, but one of the things that happened during the Exodus is where the camps are located is actually an pretty ancient elephant corridor. So as metaphor, just imagine like these acres and acres and acres of trees were plowed down, and these elephants had kind of no sense of where they were and what was going on. There's an incredible amount of displacement and then violence from the elephants. So there was actually training done with some of the refugee camp inhabitants on how to handle elephant violence. And I just bring that up because I think it's another, it's just a really big metaphor for what's happening there, like sort of displacement upon displacement.
Thanks, guys. I have a question from, we had sort of said we wouldn't really, because it's so complicated and big topic in terms of the current, political crisis in Myanmar and the coup. And Yasmin, you had touched on this a little bit, so feel free to answer, or if somebody else would like to jump in, about the connection between the current unrest that's going on in Myanmar, and especially that even before the coup, the democratically elected government had really not stood up for Rohingya. So what does that tell us about the potential maybe for a safe return and citizenship rights in the future?
Maybe I can kind of make it a really short answer to that. Currently, when I'm having dialogues with people from within Myanmar, I bring up the fact that many Rohingya advocates, including myself, who have been engaging with various different states, as well as government officials, international government bodies, the UN system, we've always mentioned the fact that Rohingya genocide is an embodiment of something that is much more widespread, that is about to come. if the international community does not intervene in the sense to protect the rest of Myanmar from the backlash and from the systemic oppression that the military is enforcing. We warned them that the current or the previous democratic transition was all a facade, and that the compromise with the military in any way, shape, or form will not truly bring peace, justice, or democracy into Myanmar, regardless of how serious the party that is trying to compromise and trying to create a democratic system within Myanmar could be. And the NLD actually proved that. And the de facto leader, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, had made that mistake of compromising. But what I'm alluding to is that when I have these dialogue and I speak about the critical theory, the critical race theory or intersectional issues, I always tell them that the system, the current system, even if the military is completely out of the picture, unless we actually rip apart the system that has not been working for anyone within Myanmar, we're not going to be able to actualize our will. We're not going to ever be able to see democracy flourish. And so it would have to come down to all of the citizens, people all together, sitting down, having discussions, having really, really difficult discussion, reparations, reconciliation, addressing different layers of oppression that each of the minoritized groups, including the majority, have, internalized or have experienced for many decades. All of this have to sort of be at the table, and it will be a really, really raw discussion, but it needs to happen on a larger scale. Then the rebuilding could actually commence. So it might sound abstract right now, but there are a lot of people who are willing to engage with this sort of concept. And it's important to note that, say that the military actually say that they're completely threatened and they just have no way to actually get themselves out of this coup without the resistance growing, and they finally relent and gave in, they might actually make another compromise with another kind of, maybe with the NLD or maybe with a completely new, sort of perceived democratic leaders in order to create the same sort of status quo. Replacing the head is not enough. We have to replace the entire system. And that would come from actually including the representation of people from all ethnic minorities at different levels of the government, at different level of administration, actually rip apart the judicial system within Myanmar, because it's filled with military people, and ensuring that the voting rights is secured for everyone in Myanmar, including the rights to be elected into the parliament. This is just a few things that comes up, but it would need to actually happen within Myanmar, what the people of Myanmar actually wants to see in the future, because the NLD style democracy will not work and will never work to actually eradicate the power of the military.
Alka, may I jump in with a
Yes,
follow-up
please.
for Yasmin? It was really interesting to hear you speak of this current events as an opportunity for the Rohingya to show solidarity with people in Myanmar, and really impressive how big generous and big your hearts are. But I wondered if you had seen any change in the way that people in Myanmar are approaching or seeing the way that Rohingya have been treated now that they're seeing some similarities from the military. Have you seen any change at all from people, even if the state, perhaps not from the state?
Yeah, At first, I was quite reluctant. Fortunately, I had worked with ALTCN for a while, for the past few months prior to the coup taking place. And I'd already known that there was some sort of change that is possible, even within the people who may have been socialized into believing in all of the hate rhetorics and the propaganda that the military actually try to convince them of. Currently, the dialogue that I'm having is not on an official site at all. It's all on Twitter, but many Burmese people, especially the Burma people, who stood to gain from the Tatmadaw by turning their blind eyes to the ethnic sufferings, are now starting to grasp at the idea that the ethnic communities have suffered long before they have, and this current coup or this current attempts to harm and hurt civilians are just the tip of the iceberg to the kind of human rights violation that Rohingya and other ethnic minorities have suffered through. I cannot speak to how many people are shifting their mindset, but I think that at least this coup had proven to the Burma people, or the rest of the country really, that they're not safe under a compromised type of quasi-democracy. They're not ever going to be safe unless they actually try to come together to abolish the system that allowed the status quo to flourish. And that's why they're calling on different nation states and different international governing bodies to completely place targeted sanctions against the military enterprise, even though they're going to have to suffer a while, and that while might actually take much longer if the military continues to be emboldened by Russia and China, for example. But they're willing to put up with suffering for a short term, but actually have true democracy, and that democracy, they call it federal democracy, which means that everybody is included in that discussion. It is changing, but I think it's just the start, and trying to encourage people to be more critical, and sometimes having to be the bigger person or extending compassion to those who are currently trying to grasp the idea is so important.
Well, we're right on the 7:30 almost hour, and I want to end actually on this message of solidarity, because I think that's where the power lies for all of us, to be able to engage with something that's happening in another part of the world and can feel so far away. I want to thank the Dickey Center, because they have really worked with me over the last month or so to organize this event, and it's just been wonderful. Tafi, Jan, Fariba, Yasmin, thank you so much for taking an hour and a half out of your time today and sharing so many really incredible perspectives. I think that we all have a much richer understanding of what's happening on the ground. So with that, I will say goodbye and thank you, and yeah, sending a lot of solidarity and good wishes to Rohingya people all over the world, from our little part of the world.